What happens when you're invited to a feast, but never meant to leave? A grand mansion, a lavish banquet, a host no one remembers inviting. The guests arrive, but something feels wrong. The food is untouched, the whispers grow louder, and the doors won't open. Why were they chosen? What secret does the manor hide? And most importantly, who will make it out alive? Watch till the end, if you dare. The letter arrived on a cold, misty evening, sealed with deep crimson wax, bearing no sender's name. Eliza stared at the elegant script, the ink swirling like tendrils of smoke. The invitation was addressed to her and a select group of acquaintances, offering an exclusive midnight feast at Ravenwood Manor, an estate long abandoned, its history shrouded in whispers of tragedy. Intrigued and uneasy, Eliza felt an inexplicable pull. Stories of the manor had been passed down like ghostly folklore, of lavish gatherings that ended in disappearances, of laughter that turned into screams. Yet, as she reread the invitation, a strange hunger stirred within her, one she couldn't quite place. That night, she shared the news with her closest friend, Daniel, who hesitated before nodding. "We shouldn't go," he muttered. "No one steps into Ravenwood and returns the same." But the invitation had an allure, one that gnawed at their curiosity like an unshakable whisper in the dark. And so, despite the warning, despite the fear curling at the edges of their thoughts, they found themselves preparing for the journey. As the carriage rumbled toward Ravenwood Manor, the forest thickened, and the road seemed to disappear beneath them, as if they were being swallowed whole. Ravenwood Manor stood like a silent beast against the night sky, its towering spires piercing the swirling mist. The carriage halted before the grand iron gates, which groaned open on their own, as if expecting them. Eliza and Daniel exchanged uneasy glances before stepping onto the stone path, their footsteps swallowed by the eerie stillness. The other guests had already gathered in the candlelit foyer, a peculiar mix of strangers, each with the same crimson-sealed invitation in hand. A butler, impossibly tall and gaunt, appeared from the shadows and gestured toward the great hall. "Dinner shall be served at midnight," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. As the clock inched closer to the fateful hour, unease slithered through the air. The flickering candlelight seemed to warp the portraits on the walls, their painted eyes following every movement. Conversations were hushed, tense. One woman, pale and trembling, leaned toward Eliza. "Something feels wrong," she whispered. "It's as if we're being watched." A sudden gust extinguished the candles, plunging the room into darkness. Gasps filled the air. Then, from the depths of the hall, a single sound echoed, a slow, deliberate scraping, like silver against bone. The feast was about to begin. When the candles flared back to life, the great dining hall was no longer empty. A grand feast had materialized, golden platters overflowing with glistening meats, fruits so rich in color they seemed unnatural, and goblets filled with a dark, swirling liquid. The air was thick with a sweet yet metallic scent that made Eliza's stomach twist. The guests hesitated. The long table, which had been bare moments ago, was now occupied by more figures than before. Hooded figures sat among them, their faces obscured, their presence unnervingly still. The butler appeared at the head of the table and raised his glass. "The master welcomes you," he intoned. "Tonight, you dine among the honored." Eliza and Daniel exchanged wary glances as the guests reluctantly took their seats. The food looked divine, yet something about it was wrong, too perfect, too glistening. A man to Eliza's left picked up a forkful of meat, brought it to his lips, and took a bite. His eyes widened in ecstasy, then in horror. He clutched his throat, gasping, his skin paling to an unnatural shade. "Eliza," Daniel whispered, gripping her arm. "We shouldn't eat." From the far end of the table, the hooded figures slowly turned toward them. A suffocating silence settled over the room as the guests hesitated, forks hovering mid-air. The man who had taken the first bite trembled violently before falling still, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. No one dared to move. Eliza's breath came in shallow gasps. The hooded figures, previously unmoving, now shifted slightly, their obscured faces turning toward those who had not yet touched their plates. The butler, still standing at the head of the table, offered a thin smile. "Eat," he murmured, his voice like dry leaves in the wind. "The master despises waste." A woman across the table shot up from her seat. I want to leave," she stammered. But the moment she turned toward the grand doors, they slammed shut with a deafening finality. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows along the walls. Panic spread like wildfire. A man lunged toward the door, banging against it with desperate fists, but the walls of the manor groaned as if alive. The windows, which once displayed the starry night, had turned pitch black, no moon, no reflection, only an abyss. Daniel grasped Eliza's wrist. "We were never meant to leave," he whispered. "This is a trap." Eliza's heart pounded as she clutched Daniel's hand. Around the table, the remaining guests sat frozen in fear, their eyes darting toward the hooded figures, who now seemed closer than before, though none had seen them move. The butler stood still, his gaze fixed on the untouched plates. Then, the whispers began. Faint at first, like a breeze through dead leaves, but growing louder, curling around them like unseen hands. Eliza turned to the man beside her, the one who had first eaten. Her breath caught in her throat. His skin, once pale, had begun to darken and stretch, his features distorting. His lips curled into a too-wide smile, his eyes now hollow pits. Across the table, others began to change. A woman let out a strangled cry as her hands withered, her fingers elongating into skeletal claws. Another guest convulsed, his flesh twisting, reforming into something unnatural, something inhuman. Eliza's grip on Daniel tightened. "They're becoming," she stopped, unable to say it aloud. One of the hooded figures finally spoke, its voice layered with echoes. "The feast must continue." Eliza realized, with cold horror, that the guests weren't just eating the food. They were becoming part of it. Eliza's stomach churned as she watched the grotesque transformation unfold before her. The guests who had eaten were no longer human, their bodies convulsed, twisting into monstrous forms, their flesh warping as if molded by unseen hands. Their faces stretched, mouths widening into permanent, hungry grins. Daniel yanked her arm. "We have to get out, now." But the butler's voice cut through the rising panic. "You misunderstand," he said, his expression eerily calm. "You are not guests at this feast. You are the feast." Eliza's breath hitched. The realization settled over her like ice. The food, the rich, glistening meat, the dark, swirling drink, it wasn't ordinary. It was them. The ones who had dined before, consumed and reborn into this unholy cycle. The hooded figures lifted their hands, and the room itself seemed to shift. The grand dining hall stretched, the walls pulsing as if alive. The faces of past victims flickered in the candlelight, etched into the very wood of the long table, their silent screams frozen in time. A sharp, wet tearing sound filled the air as the first of the transformed guests turned toward the remaining few, their newly formed jaws snapping open. The feast was far from over. Eliza's pulse roared in her ears as the first of the transformed guests lunged, their grotesque limbs jerking unnaturally. Daniel shoved a chair in front of them, knocking one creature back, its gnarled fingers clawing at the air. "We need to get to the door," Daniel shouted, dragging Eliza along. The remaining guests scattered in blind panic, some sprinting toward the windows, only to recoil in horror. There was nothing outside, only an endless black void. The manor had sealed itself, trapping them in its hungry maw. One man, driven by sheer desperation, grabbed a candelabrum and swung it at an advancing creature. The flame touched its twisted flesh, and an agonized wail erupted from its throat. The thing recoiled, its body writhing, its face contorting between human and monster. Fire. That was the key. Eliza snatched a burning candle, her hands trembling. The chandeliers, if we set the room ablaze, it might break whatever force is holding this place together. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed another candle and hurled it at the heavy drapes. the fabric ignited instantly. Flames licked up the walls, and for the first time, the manor seemed to scream. But it wasn't done with them yet. The fire spread rapidly, casting twisted shadows along the walls. The grotesque creatures shrieked, their warped bodies writhing as the flames consumed them. The guests who had yet to transform scrambled toward the grand doors, but they remained sealed, the wood refusing to splinter even under their desperate blows. Eliza's lungs burned as thick smoke filled the air. The butler still stood at the head of the table, untouched by the chaos, watching them with something almost like amusement. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice calm despite the inferno. "The feast is eternal." Then the room shifted. The grand table, now fully engulfed, groaned as its surface split apart. Beneath it, something vast and pulsating was revealed, a grotesque mass of flesh and gaping mouths, writhing hungrily. Eliza's stomach turned. The manor wasn't just cursed. It was alive. It had been feeding for centuries, devouring guests and turning them into its next meal. The food on their plates hadn't just been from past victims, it had been part of the manor itself, a cycle of endless consumption. As the monstrous heart of the house pulsed beneath them, Eliza realized with terror that the fire wasn't destroying the manor. It was awakening it. The walls of Ravenwood Manor trembled, the very foundation groaning as the monstrous heart beneath the table pulsed faster. Flames licked up the towering walls, but instead of crumbling, the manor seemed to breathe, as though feeding off the fire itself. Eliza and Daniel staggered backward as the butler finally moved, stepping away from the table. His face, once human, began to distort, stretching into something inhuman. "You were chosen," he murmured, his voice now layered with a dozen others. "You will never leave." The surviving guests screamed as the monstrous table split open, its gaping mouths sucking them in, one by one. Their shrieks were cut off abruptly, their bodies vanishing into the endless hunger below. Daniel grabbed Eliza's hand. "Jump," he yelled, pointing toward a stained glass window, now cracked from the heat. With no other choice, they ran, leaping just as the manor let out a deafening, unearthly roar. They hit the ground hard, rolling onto damp grass. The night was eerily silent. Behind them, Ravenwood Manor stood untouched, as if nothing had happened. The grand doors creaked open once more, an invitation extended to its next guests. The feast would never end. And just like that, the feast is over, but Ravenwood Manor never truly lets its guests go. The whispers linger, the table remains set, and somewhere in the shadows, a new invitation is being prepared. Tell me, would you accept it? Would you step into the grand halls, take a seat at the table, and risk becoming part of the legend? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more tales that will keep you up at night. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed.